James 5 is the final chapter, obviously, in our studies here in James. And at the beginning of the week, I had thought that we would try to just cover all of through verse 12, because what James is dealing with is social injustice. Is one of his three main themes. He talks about wisdom, and he talks about how we use our speech. He talks about trials and how those are going to affect the Christian life and how they should respond. And the third thing there is that he deals with these injustices that we see. And I think at the top of your bulletin there, it says that it's injustices both around us and toward us. And what we read about in the first 6 verses are things that aren't necessarily being said to the people that are there. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. In verse 7 through 12, continue to deal with that, but because there's so much just in these first 6 verses, I thought it appropriate to take an extra week and go just halfway there. So we see the beginning of the first verse there is very similar to what we just read a chapter ago in chapter 4 and verse 13, when James began to speak to a different group of people. I said last week that when James says that word, depending on how you see it there, go to now, or it means attention, it's grabbing your attention there. And he's grabbing attention not only to the people that he's going to speak towards, but also to the activity or the behavior that these people are involved with. And earlier he spoke to the people that lived their life without regarding the will of God, without regarding God's sovereignty, without regarding anything about what God had in mind for their life, and just living life as they wanted to live it. I'm going to do it this way. A few verses before that, they were out of pride. He's kind of left this pride thing, although you can see hints of it throughout the rest of the letter here. But out of pride, I do several things. I try to determine other people's lives, and then now and then most recently he talked to people who try to determine the outcome of their own lives. You can read that another time. But this week, he begins he shifts his attention. Now, this is interesting because there is a lot of debate whether or not that James is actually speaking to people sitting in his audience. He's writing a letter, obviously, but the person reading this letter, there would be some that would say, well, these people aren't even in the audience that James is speaking about. And others would say that they were in the audience. And I happen to think that they were not part of the audience. And this is a form of dialogue called, I think it's called hypostrophe. And it was similar to what Jesus did when he when he pronounced the woes on the different people. Remember when he said woe unto Chorazin and Bethsaida and Capernaum, and he talked about some of the activity and behavior that they were involved in, but he wasn't speaking to them. He was speaking for the benefit of his disciples about Chorazin, in a way, though, that it sounded like he was talking to Chorazin or talking to Bethsaida. And so what he had to say to Bethsaida, or what he had to say to Chorazin, or what James has to say to these rich people, though they didn't really hear that message because it's likely they weren't in the audience, it was for the benefit of the other people here. And in context, as we'll see specifically next week, that the people that hear this message are the people who are being oppressed. I want to go back and read a little bit of this and to try to help unpack this, and then what looks difficult, maybe the difficult verses are coming at the end, I think. And so I'm going to ask Todd to take care of the end and preach those last few verses, because those are the ones that I'm a little bit nervous about. I was hoping that they would disappear by the time we got to chapter 5 when we started, and they're still there. And so I'm going to start reading in verse number 1. Go to now, you rich men, weep and howl for your miseries that shall come upon you. So there's that phrase there, go to now. It's a Greek phrase. It just basically means listen up, attention, hey, right here, look up here. And that's what he's doing. He's trying to recapture their attention before they doze off, before they start thinking of other things. And since he's shifting his theme, he's shifting the point of his message, he wants to recapture their attention. Again, not necessarily the people who are guilty of these things he's talking about, but he wants to grab the attention of the listener to help them to understand where they are. He says, weep and howl. I want you to cry loud. I want you to mourn. I want you to just break down and sob and weep. Why? Because miseries are coming upon you. Your wealth, your riches, your garments, and your gold and silver. And notice what he starts hitting home all of the things that are precious to these people. He says there in verse number 2, your riches are corrupted and your garments are moth-eaten. Verse 3, your gold and silver is cankered, and the rust of them shall be a witness against you, and shall eat your flesh as it were fire. You've heaped treasure together for the last days. And really, these people are kind of awful when we start unpacking what they've been doing, their recent behavior. But James says here, not to repent. He doesn't talk about all the things that you've done and this is what you need to do to fix it, to get back in line with where you should be, to get right with God, if you will. He doesn't even address the repentance part. He just says, judgment's coming, so weep and howl. Fall down on your face and start crying and sobbing, realizing that the end is coming and that you can do nothing about it. And he says here that your wealth is decayed. It means it's corrupted. It's rotted away. I can't help but think about how in those days wealth could have been determined in the amount of. Remember the story? We're going to look at it in just a little bit. But the parable that Jesus told of the rich fool, that he had a bumper crop one year, a great harvest, and it was more than his barns could fill. And he said, what am I going to do? He said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barn. I'll build an even bigger barn. And then I'm going to sit back, relax, and just take it easy for the rest of my life. And God said, you're a fool. You don't even know that tonight you're going to die. You don't even realize that this is your last day on this earth. And what good is all that going to be? His riches, his wealth was in his crop. And I get this image in my head as we read through that of corrupted, rotting away produce, if you can imagine that. If many of you farmers, the last thing you want to see when you walk in your barn or that silo or wherever you keep it is rotting away. That hay maybe that's got mold on it, or the corn it's just rotten and useless and worthless. And that's what James is trying to get them to understand. These three things that those rich people hold most dear in life are beginning to become worthless and useless to them in every way imaginable. He says that your clothes are moth-eaten. I haven't ever had a shirt that was moth-eaten, but I know that we use the mothballs, right, for those things, and those things stink to high heaven. And that's what James is saying here. Your clothes become moth-eaten. They're useless. Has anybody ever pulled out a sweater or a shirt or something and there's just a big giant hole, moth ate it? Anybody ever happened that before? No? Okay, just in James's time, I guess. A few people out here. But it's this idea that if you pull out a shirt and it's moth-eaten, which means it's got a big old hole in it, you can't wear it anymore. Well, nowadays you can, because that would be kind of the style. But in that day, people had a little bit more sense about what they put on their bodies. And if it looked awful, they didn't put it on. And that was what James is trying to get across. Now, remember in chapter 2 and verse 2, when James was talking about how we accept people and we're not supposed to show prejudice when people come to church, and he described two types of people that come into church. The first was a rich man, and he was described by his clothes. He said he came in and he had the nicest clothes on. He had jewelry all over his hands. He was obviously rich by his clothes. And in this culture, that was one of the ways that you showed how wealthy you were, by the clothes that you wore. And James is hitting them hard in an area that is very, very sensitive to them, and that is their garments, their clothes. And he says, those beautiful garments that you have, that you wear around town to show off how wealthy you are, they're worthless and useless. You might as well tear them up and use them for rags. You might as well give them to the Goodwill. You might as well just toss them and burn them, because they're moth-eaten. They can't be used for what you hope they were used for. It's useless. And then he said, your gold is corroded. And this is interesting, because gold doesn't rust, and that's basically what he's saying there. Later on, he says verse number 3. It says that the rust of them shall be a witness against you. And this word rust is actually the same word that he used in chapter 3 and verse 8 when he talked about poison, saying that the tongue is an unruly evil full of deadly poison. And so the word that he uses both means poison and it means rust. But without getting too technical and diving into an area of which I have no expertise, there's many of those. But he's saying there that your gold has become useless. Your gold has become worthless. The silver that you've amassed to yourselves, and you've built that big silo of gold and silver coins, it's all rusty. Even the very thing that you thought was untouchable, has been touched and decayed and tarnished and unusable. Reminds me of what Jesus said in Matthew 6:19 let me read it to you, but he was talking about laying up treasure in heaven rather than on earth because of the rust and the moths. He says in Matthew 6 and verse 19, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt." There are no moths in heaven. Amen? That's great. You can leave the light on, and there are no moths swirling around you in heaven. There's no light. There's no need for night, right? But there's a difference in the perspective that these rich folk have, and then the one that James is trying to get them to handle. And what James is trying to do is not turn the perspective of the rich folk. He's trying to affect the perspective of the other folk. It would be as if I were James speaking James's letter to you, you would not be the rich people I'm talking about. You're not the rich people of 5 verse 1. And get an amen there. You say, I'm not rich. I'm not there. You check my bank account. I'm talking about someone else who's not even here. But I'm saying it to you for your benefit and trying to get them. And later what we're going to see is that God is going to avenge these people because they have been mistreated. But James is reminding these people who aren't in the audience, if you will, these people who are rich oppressors, everything you hold dear is completely useless to you now. Everything that made you so special is gone. It's worthless. And he says even that rusty gold is going to become an evidence and a testimony against you. And it's going to eat your flesh like fire. Not only is your gold and your silver eaten away or corroded away, but that same corrosion is going to condemn you and eat away at you. He says that which you relied on to bless you is now going to turn on you and curse you. Now why? Why is this going to happen? Is God against rich people? Is James blasting these folks because they are wealthy? Not at all. He's blasting them because of what they did with their wealth. Notice there in verse number 3, at the end there, "Ye have heaped treasure together for the last days." Think about that for a moment. The last days mean that the days are running out. Now, I've always thought that it would be wonderful to know the exact day when I was either going to die or when Jesus was going to come back. Now, if I knew one of those two dates was going to be like a month from now, or let's say the end of this year, I would stop saving my money. I would stop being responsible with my money. I would go on a trip. I would stop paying a lot of places I didn't want to pay anymore. And I would start spending my money in other places that right now I say, Tim, you have to be responsible. You can't just eat a bunch of candy. Okay, you can't just you have to limit yourself on how much fun you can have. Yeah, that's called being an adult. And adulting is not easy, nor is it always fun, contrary to what kids may think. But if I knew that I was going to die on a specific day, or if I knew that the last day was on a specific day, why save your money? Spend it all up. It's useless. Sometimes when I was in school, my teacher would do this like little classroom money. Maybe your teacher did that. And you'd have little classroom money to use up. And the only problem was there were some kids who saved and saved and saved. And that's great until they got into the next grade and that teacher didn't recognize that legal tender. And it was just paper again. Who cares then, right? You play Monopoly. It doesn't matter if you have $1 million once the game is over. The game is over. That was the last days. There's no reason to be saving it. And here, these people, speaking of, and James is not talking about the end of their life, but rather he's talking about the coming judgment that is coming on them, the last days, if you were, of the coming of Christ. It's an imminent return, and though he is not returned, we are still in those last days. And James is saying here, you rich folk are using your money in the wrong place. Actually, the problem is that you're not using it. You are hoarding it to yourself, heaping it together. You didn't do anything good with it. You kept it for yourself and at the expense and suffering of the people around you. Not just anybody around you, but specifically your employees. So these were wealthy folk who had enough to hire people to work for them, but they didn't pay them. He goes on and he explains it in verse 4. Behold, the hire of the laborers who have reaped down your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud, crieth. You're not paying them. You're making them go out into the field. And I thought of y'all as I read this, because I thought, this is farming work right here. And this is a farm town. And most of you know what it's like to go out and spend a day out in a field somewhere doing hard work. And you can imagine how frustrated you would be if you did all the work and you got back to and at this culture they got paid every day. And in fact, that was part of the Levitical law that the Jews were supposed to pay every day their employees for what they did. The workman is worthy, labor's worthy of his hire. And yet these people were taking advantage of them and not paying them, keeping it back by fraud. But it had gotten to such an extent that there's nothing that these laborers could do about it. Later on, we see that they take them to court, and they begin to take everything away from them. So basically, they've turned these people into their slaves. You will do the work, and you will get nothing in return. And I will take everything that you have away from you. Why? So that I can have more. So because I'm selfish, and because I'm greedy. They withheld their pay and denied wages, and these denied wages cry out against them, as well as the cries of their suffering, very similar to what God said about Abel's blood. When Cain spilled Abel's blood on the ground, and God told Cain, I hear the voice of your brother crying, his blood calls out to me. It cries out for justice. And these people, late at night after they've worked all day in the field for you, and they've blistered their backs in the sun, and they've calloused their hands, and they've given everything that they've got, and you give them nothing in return. They have no food. Many of them dying and starving because of these things. As we get down into the next part of the chapter, and we see how horribly these people were suffering, and why? Because of the greed and the selfishness of their masters. And they lie in bed, and they weep, and they listen to their children going without food, and they're crying themselves asleep. And those cries reach the ears of, he says, the Lord of Sabaoth. A weird word. We don't use it ever. It doesn't mean Sabbath. Like what we'd say, like remember the Sabbath day. The word Sabaoth means hosts. It's a military term. It's the Lord of hosts. It's Captain Jesus, General God, is coming down to avenge the very people you've been taking advantage of. And he says there in verse number 4, the hire of the laborers who have reaped down your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud, crieth, and the cries of them which have reaped are entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth, or of the Lord of hosts. God has heard their cries, and He's coming with a military mindset. He's coming to avenge these people, to avenge them and make everything right. And that's partly why James is speaking in the ears of the oppressed people, because he wants them to know, even as we see the very first 3 words of the next passage, he says, be patient, therefore. Wait. Be patient. We'll get into that more next week, but God is coming, and God is going to make it all right. And He's speaking to people who have been taken advantage of. And He's speaking to people who have been oppressed. Not the rich people who are oppressing. And yet, God says to them, wait. It's their day is coming. I will take care of that. I don't miss any of these things. But I want to focus on these rich oppressors this morning. Why did they do these things? He said there in verse number 5, ye have lived in pleasure on the earth and have been wanton. The word wanton there means without limits. It's unrestrained. It's basically saying that you've lived in extravagant luxury and unrestrained self-indulgence. That describes some people even today. We live in a world of extravagance. We live in a world of unrestrained indulgence. What do you want? Have 10 of them. You walked in the church this morning and you saw donuts. If you're a donut lover, you had to practice restraint, right? Someone cut them up into little tiny pieces, which is actually good because you eat one, it doesn't count. You have to eat like 5 or 6 at a time. But if you keep coming back and only taking one, none of those count. And that's how I think. And so, but we live in a world that is all about me, right? Thanksgiving is coming up. What are we going to do? How many of you will eat so much that you will hurt on Thanksgiving Day? Would you raise your hand? That's the American way. The rest of you, I don't know what's wrong with you. But then those of us who raise our hands, you know what we're going to do? As soon as we get the slightest bit of comfort back, we're going back to the table. We're going to get a piece of pie as we walk back to the couch so we can sit back and go, oh, that hurts. And then a little bit later, like, all right, I think I got a little bit more room. Here we go. And you come back because that's not how the Pilgrims celebrated Thanksgiving. That's not, there were no recliners. There was no stuff in your face. It was like, hey, this is the first time we have a real meal. Let's eat, you know. But that's how our culture is. That's how this culture was. The rich self-indulging, getting everything they can in their bellies, getting everything that they want. We all know someone like that, right? They have 3 of everything. If you need to borrow something, that person's got it. Have you ever used it? No. Why do you have it? Well, I just wanted it. Thought it looked good. They're the people that max credit cards on Home Shopping Network. Or they're the people that Amazon has given them special privileges because they're the ones keeping Amazon in business because they're just constantly buying. The UPS guy stops by their house 3 times daily because they're just constantly filling their desires. And I'm not talking about needs. I'm not talking about the things that we have to have. And I'm going somewhere with this, but so hang on with me here. But he says that these people lived in self-indulgence and extravagance at the expense of people around them. There's nothing wrong with having nice things. There's nothing wrong with enjoying it a little bit. The problem here was that the people all around them were dying. They were suffering. They were starving while they sat in their homes getting rich and fat. There were people outside dying of starvation. While they worried about getting their 20th new garment, there were people out there trying to piece together something to keep them from being naked. That was the problem in this society, and that was the problem with their behavior. They didn't realize it, God said, though, but I like how James is speaking to them. He's been so nice for 4 chapters. I mean, he's been hitting some hard topics, but been so nice about it. But then all of a sudden, he doesn't like these people. And then not because he doesn't like rich people, he doesn't like how they've been treating people. And he says, I like this, in verse number 5. He says, you've nourished your hearts as in a day of slaughter. He says, you don't even realize it. But you were only fattening yourself up like a cow. Those cows that many of you have. How many of you have an animal that you're fattening up? You're gonna butcher it one day and eat it. Would you raise your hand? Nobody? Just a few of you? Cow, pig, whatever. We don't have them, but we buy them that way. You fatten them up, right? And if you walk out on butcher day and the cow looks a little lean or gaunt, you give it a little bit more time. That turkey, there are turkeys right now walking around thinking, this is awesome. I get as much food as I want. This is going to be the life. Only to find out that in just a few weeks, there's a reason they've been fattened up, isn't there? So we can sit down and enjoy them. And that's what James is saying to you rich folk. He says, hey, eat it up. You're going to get fatter and fatter for slaughter day. One day, the Lord of hosts is going to come out into the field, and he's going to find the fat cows. You're going to slaughter them. You've only fattened yourself up for the day of slaughter. And then what he says there in verse number 6, you condemned and killed the just. These are people they're innocent people. Not necessarily speaking towards Christians, but just innocent in the general term. And these are people who didn't fight back. And they didn't fight back because they couldn't fight back. They had nothing. These were people who were abused and taken advantage of simply because they could do it. And he says to them that you used your wealthy status to take whatever from whomever you wanted. And these people didn't put up a fight because they couldn't. They worked for you, but you didn't pay them. Then the word condemn there is a bit of a legal term. It's got a little legal taste to it. You took them to court and took away what they did have, even though you should owe them. Remember in chapter 2 I talked about in this system, especially in the Roman culture, it favored the rich. And the poor people couldn't raise accusations against rich folks. And that's what's happening here. Because I'm rich, I'm taking advantage of it, and I'm going to take away from you. Think about Jezebel and her husband Ahab. Ahab looked out his window. He saw a vineyard that he said, I like grapes. I want that vineyard right there. The man was king. He could have had anywhere. He probably had vineyards, but he wanted that one. He wanted the only one that Naboth had, and Jezebel killed Naboth so that they could add to their wealth. David and Bathsheba. David looks out a window. He sees a woman. He's already got a wife. I think he has a couple at this time. But he sees one he wants. And he takes it. And Nathan the prophet comes to him and he says, hey, let me tell you a story. There was a man. He had a bunch of sheep. He had tons of sheep. But his friend came over and he wanted to give him a lamb as a meal. And instead of going out to his flock of hundreds, he went over to his neighbor's house that had one sheep. And he took that sheep. Why didn't he want to take one from his own? Because he was greedy. He was selfish. He was living only for himself. And he went to this one man and he took his only sheep away from him. And he said, you're that man. You took that one man's wife, and you're to blame. And he stuck his bony finger out in his face, and that's what James continues to pour out to these people who are no doubt Jewish and should know the law and should be living according to God's law, but they're not. They're living according to their own self. These are probably some of the very people that live with this attitude back in chapter 4. I do what I want to do. I'm in charge. I am God. Me. And James says, Judgment day is coming. Now again, it is likely that these people weren't in the audience to hear the judgment, but James is directing his speech to the oppressed. What is the benefit of their hearing? Well, as I said, we've seen many illustrations of them throughout Scripture of this very scene played out. Luke 12:16, I mentioned it to you about how the rich man lived for himself, had more than enough, and yet he kept it all. In Luke 16, we read about the rich man and Lazarus, who one day the rich man died, and Jesus said he went to hell. He lifted up his eyes in torment, and he called out to Father Abraham, and Abraham said, hey, in your life you enjoyed it. You lived it up, and you had all the nice things, and now you're tormented. Oh, poor Lazarus over there, he sat outside your gate, and he had a horrible worldly life, but now he's comforted in heaven. The tables have turned, and there's a subtle slight there against how the rich man ignored Lazarus. Now it's important for us to note that James is not condemning these people because they're rich. Please don't walk away with that. There's nothing wrong with money. Every good gift comes from God, right? And that is one of the gifts that God gives people. There are several people recorded in the Scriptures who God blessed with great wealth. Solomon, Abraham. Jesus was blessed, even his earthly life, by rich people. Think of Joseph of Arimathea, who took Jesus and buried him in his tomb. He was buried with the rich. He needed a rich guy to fulfill the prophecy. Jesus was not condemning rich. James does not condemn the rich. There is no spiritual advantage to being poor. But what James is saying is that being wealthy puts you in a unique position to help a lot of suffering people. And that's what these people missed out on. And they are condemned because they mistreated the very folks they should have helped. They used their wealth for themselves instead of for other people. Let me apply this to us today. I don't believe that any of us are extravagantly rich. I could be wrong. I don't think so. And I don't know of any of us that are poverty level poor. That could be wrong again. But let me take two applications here and make some sense of this for you. Number one, stop counting other people's money. The intention here is not for us to look around and decide who the rich folk are and make sure that they get a copy of James 5, 1 through 6. Hey, rich folk, what's your problem? You know, I remember a missionary, I think when I was a kid, came by our church and said that he was in some country. It was in the culture of that country to, if you had two of anything, the second one was up for grabs. So if you had 2 hams, they felt more than welcome to walk in and take one because you had 2. You don't need 2, you only need 1. And this was an American missionary who was like, hey, that's my ham, you know? And he was upset, but in their culture it was, hey, you've got 2, why aren't you sharing? And that's not what we're supposed to be doing, looking around and figuring out who's got more. Because here's what we do. If I asked you to raise your hand, I'm not going to, but if I asked you to raise your hand and I said, raise your hand if you feel that you're rich, I don't think anybody would really raise their hand. Except the uber spiritual people like, I'm rich in God. Like, no, we're talking about rich in dollars, okay? Rich in cash. None of us would say rich in, I have tons of money. And if I said, who is a rich person? We would generally define a rich person as someone who has more cash than I do. That's how rich is. And if I get a raise, I bump the definition of what rich is to just over what I am. We do the same thing with age, right? You're not old as just 20 years older than what you currently are. And so if you're 15, if you're 35, you are 1 foot in the grave, right? Until you hit 35 and you realize, no, that's a long ways away from now. We do the same thing with our money. We don't consider ourselves rich. I mean, he's not talking to me. I'm not that rich. But you know who is rich? That guy who just got a brand new truck. Those folks that just built their own, they just built their own dream home in Florida. That guy that just got a new boat. That guy that always has the nicest thing. He's rich. He's the one who needs this verse. And he's the one who should be helping the poor. But as I said, this is not a condemnation of those who have more money than I do, but of those who misuse the wealth that they have. Now, if I were to ask you to be honest and raise your hand, I think I could get every one of you to say, I do have some measure of wealth. I think that would be a fair statement. Now, you might not have as big a pile of money as you would like to have, but I think that all of us could say, I do have some measure of wealth. And that's the main issue that James is trying to pull out here. What are you doing with your wealth? We're not intended to look around for those with more gold than we have. We are to look at how we use the gold that we have. It's not for me to decide what is extravagant for you. It's not for me to say, you probably shouldn't have bought that truck. That's a little bit too showy for you. I have a friend who bought a Hummer. I think that's a cool car to have. He told me he got more flack from folks because it was too extravagant for him. Shouldn't have bought that. You have no idea how much I make, you know? You have no idea what I did to get this thing. But they thought, no, you shouldn't have those things. And meanwhile, those people are pulling into the parking lot with their own brand new vehicles. But it's just not as nice as that guy. So he's the rich guy, not me. Someone goes on a fancy trip, say, oh, that was too much. Shouldn't have gone there. Shouldn't have done that. Someone has a bigger TV than me. Oh, yeah, that's extravagant. Until I get one that size. And then, oh, yeah, no, that's completely appropriate. See how we play this game? James says, stop counting other people's gold. Later on, James is going to instruct these people in verse 9 to stop complaining, and I wonder if this doesn't have something to do with it. Yeah, I'm a steward over what God has given me, and you are a steward over what God has given you. So it's not for me to decide how you should spend the money you have. Number 2, though, we should use our wealth to help other people. See, your wealth is not simply so that you can live well. If every gift that we have comes from God, according to James 1:17, then I should ask the question, why did God give this to me? I sure wish He'd give me more. But why did God give this to me? Is it so that I could blow it all on candy? Remember when we were kids and this is the first thing that came to our mind? You got $5, what are you going to do? Candy. All of it. Right now. Hopefully we grow a little bit more mature as we use it, and we only spend like $3 on candy, and then we save the rest. But we're not given what we have. And that goes beyond your financial wealth. It goes to anything. Everything you have comes from God. Why did God give it to you? Why do you have the things that you have? Why did God plan to give them to you? There's a balance now. Speaking of finances, there is a balance of providing for your own. You're supposed to. The Bible says that if you don't, you're worse than an unbeliever. You don't provide for your own. There's a balance between providing for your own and saving for the future and even being generous. You've got to find that balance. You can't swing to the one side and say, I'm keeping it all to myself. Likewise, we can't swing to the other, say, I'm just going to give it all away and wait for someone else to take care of me. There's a balance there. I asked the question there, and kind of close this way here. As Christians, it's likely that this first part of the passage wasn't even directed at Christians, just to maybe Jewish folks, maybe Christians, I don't know. Likely it's not. But as I read this, I have to ask myself, am I so tied to money that I let it control me? Am I one of those stingy Christians? Those greedy people? I got to keep every bit of it for myself. You know, you can find a person's generosity when you go to a restaurant with them, right? You start figuring out how much their tip is going to be. I ain't giving them a penny more. Like, you know what? Someone taught me a long time ago. I don't tip based on your service. I tip based on who I am. I tip because I'm trying to be a generous person. And I don't, if you're a horrible person, I'm going to give you what I normally would give. If you're great, I might go over that. But I don't tip you because of who you are. I try to tip because of who I'm trying to be. I have to ask myself this question: do I take advantage of others in order to save a few bucks? The aspect of life. Let it not be said that Christians are the ones who will squeeze a dollar out of whoever they can. I'll be a little bit dishonest in this area because I want to save a few bucks. Got to be a good steward, you know. That's not what it means. Am I guilty of wasting what others so desperately need? This is an instruction, at the very least, a reminder for me to look around. And though my little pile of wealth might not be as big as I hoped it would be, it's a whole lot bigger than other people's. There's a place in your notes, I think it's called Global Rich List. Check that out. Type that in. All it says is, how much do you make in a year? That's all you got to do. Type it in. How much do you make in a year? And it will tell you where you rank in the world. I think Chautauqua County, I looked at it last night, average income is about $43,000 for a year, Chautauqua County. And that makes you at least in the wealthy 1% of the world. The world. And then it goes down and it says, it will take you 5 minutes or something to buy a Coke. It would take someone in Ghana 6 hours to work to make enough money. I remember it said that if you could pay the salaries of 20-something doctors in some third world country with what you live on. When you get away from that, when you read that, you walk away and you think, you know what? I don't have it as good as my neighbor does, but I got it a whole lot better than what some of these other people do. I got a roof on my head. I got clothes on my back. And they're not the same clothes that I wore last week or yesterday. I've got a car to drive. It may not be the fastest. It may not be the sleekest. It may have rust flames going down the side, the panels. But it gets me from there to there. I may not have everything I want, but I do have everything I need. And in times, there are things that I am able to go and, splurge a little bit more on and get something a little bit nicer. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm very good at making sure that I take care of me. We talked about that. I like pleasing me. We have those lusts within us. The challenge is, the balance is, looking out and seeing others around us and saying, who needs my help? How can I help those people? The rich people in James's day were using their wealth to abuse and oppress. Many Christians suffered at their hands. We would agree that these rich people were wrong, but I wonder if we're not guilty of the same behavior sometimes. I'm a steward. If I'm a steward of God's money, then I need to ask myself, what does God want me to do with it? Let us not be guilty of wasting. Let us not be guilty of judging, counting other people's money. One day, we're going to die. It's going to happen to all of us. None of us have ever beaten death, and all that money that you have is no longer to be of any use to you. I'm not saying you need to go and spend it all today. I'm not saying that if you get $100, you need to give 99 of it away and live on that one and make your family suffer. I'm not saying any of those things. But I am saying that take a look at what you're doing right now, and are you being generous? Are you doing anything for the other ones around you? We've all probably been in that situation when we were the ones that needed the help, when we were the ones that needed some assistance, and somebody stepped out and said, hey, I got a little extra. Let me help you. Let us find opportunities where we can be that person. Say, hey, I get to help here. I got some money. And it doesn't take much. Jesus used a little boy's lunch that was just enough for him to help a whole bunch of people. Jesus used a widow woman who threw in 2 pennies and said she gave more than everybody else. And now we talk about her still to this day. It doesn't take a whole lot. It takes a heart that says, God blessed me with something. I want to be a blessing to somebody else. Would you pray with me, please?